When Elena Navarro climbed into the attic of her late grandaunt's stone house outside Salamanca, she expected dust, trunks, and the usual leftovers of a long life. Old linens, broken lamps, a box of church papers nobody had opened in 50 years. What she did not expect was a photograph that would make her question every story her family had repeated around kitchen tables for generations. The picture was tucked inside a shallow cedar box beneath yellowed letters and a stack of prayer cards. It had the stiff, formal look of an early studio portrait, the kind families paid for once, maybe twice, in a lifetime. On the back, in elegant brown ink that had faded at the edges, someone had written a date. May 19, 05. The image showed 5 people arranged in careful order. A stern man with a dark beard sat in the center, one hand resting on the arm of his chair. Beside him stood a very young woman holding an infant. 2 girls, both old enough to stand still but not old enough to hide there. Boredom completed the group. Everyone wore their best clothes. Everyone looked serious. Everyone looked as if they understood that this photograph was meant to stand in for something larger than a single afternoon. Elena had seen the portrait once before in a relative's hallway years ago, but only in passing. Back then, it was introduced to her in the same casual way old family photos usually are. That's your great-great-grandfather, Matteo. That's his wife, Teresa. Those are the girls. Nobody lingered on it. Nobody treated it like a puzzle. But now, sitting cross-legged in a hot attic with the light slanting through a tiny window, Elena looked more closely. And the longer she looked, the stranger it felt. The woman holding the baby did not look like the mother of 3 children. It wasn't just that she seemed young. She seemed too young. Her face still had the softness of late adolescence. Her shoulders were set in a way that looked more practiced than natural, as if she were trying to wear authority rather than living inside it. Even her expression carried something that didn't match the family legend. Instead of the settled, tired steadiness Elena associated with women raising children in old photographs, there was tension in her eyes, not panic exactly, more like someone forcing herself to stand in the place the moment required. Elena couldn't shake it. A week later, she carried the photograph to Salamanca and showed it to a historical image specialist named Dr. Andrés Varela, a man who consulted for local museums and universities. His office sat in an old civic building with high ceilings, narrow windows, and shelves full of catalogs on Iberian photography. Elena expected him to glance at it, maybe comment on the clothes, maybe estimate the studio. Instead, he leaned in almost immediately. "This is a better print than most families keep," he said. "Whoever paid for this went to a proper studio." He placed the photograph under a magnifying lamp and began talking through the details in that calm, methodical tone experts sometimes use when they don't want to get ahead of the evidence. The backdrop, he said, suggested an urban photographer rather than a village one. The lighting was deliberate. The print quality was strong. The cardstock was expensive enough that the family had either saved for it or considered the sitting important. Then he stopped on the young woman's face. "How old was she supposed to be?" he asked. Elena shrugged. "According to what I was told, she was the mother. My family always said the man was Matteo Navarro. The woman was his wife Teresa, and the children were theirs." Dr. Varela adjusted the lamp, then looked again. "I can't give you an exact age from a photograph," he said, "but I'd be surprised if she were much older than 17. 18 at the very most." Elena laughed once softly because that was exactly what had bothered her. He wasn't done. Using digital enlargement and comparison techniques developed for historical portrait work, he examined the relationships among the faces. The 2 older girls shared very strong structural similarities with the young woman. Not just a family resemblance, but something closer. The angle of the brows, the shape of the nose, the spacing of the eyes. Even without modern software screaming a conclusion at them, the implication was hard to ignore. "If your family story is right," he said carefully, "then the ages don't make sense. But if she's not their mother—" He didn't need to finish. Elena felt a cold little drop in her stomach. If she wasn't the mother, then who was she? And if the family had gotten that wrong, what else had been wrong all along? The search began in the parish archive of San Esteban de Valmora. The small Castilian town where Elena's family had lived before the 20th century scattered everyone in different directions. The archivist, Sister Beatrice, was one of those women who seemed to know more than the shelves around her. She moved slowly, but she moved with confidence, as if the records belonged not to the church, but to her memory. Together they started with the baptisms and marriages around the turn of the century. The first major entry appeared in 1887. Mateo Navarro Ruiz married Lucia Serrano Gil, so the family story was already wrong. Not Teresa. Lucia. Sister Beatrice traced the lines with one finger while Elena wrote down every detail. Over the next several pages, the births came into view. Inez Navarro, born 1888. Clara Navarro, born 1891. Julia Navarro, born 1897. And finally, Rafael Navarro, born February 1905. Elena stared at the names. If Clara had been born in 1891, then by May 1905, she would have been 14, almost 15. Too young to be the mother of the infant, yes. But old enough to be the young woman in the picture, maybe not. If Julia had been born in 1897, she was only 8. That fit, one of the younger girls, which meant the standing young woman had to be Inez, the oldest daughter. 17 years old, Dr. Varela had been right. Then came the entry that made the whole room feel smaller. Lucia Serrano Gil died in March 1905, 6 weeks after Raphael's birth. Cause of death, postpartum fever. Elena sat back in the wooden chair and let out a slow breath. The photograph had been taken in May 1905, barely 2 months after the mother's death. That changed everything. What her family had called a standard portrait of parents and children was not that at all. It was a carefully staged image taken in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophe. The young woman holding the baby was not the mother. She was the eldest daughter, standing in the mother's place because someone had decided the family must still look whole. Once Elena saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The stiff posture, the strain around Inez's eyes, the way the baby seemed almost too heavy for arms still learning the role they'd been assigned. The photograph was no longer just formal. It was desperate, desperate to say nothing had collapsed. Over the next month, Elena dug through municipal registries, tax rolls, and notarial records. Piece by piece, a harder story emerged. Mateo had not remarried quickly. In fact, there was no sign he remarried at all. The household after Lucia's death remained Mateo, Inez, Clara, Julia, and baby Rafael. That meant the running of the house fell somewhere. And that somewhere was obvious. Inez. The living memory of the family filled in the rest. Elena's first meaningful conversation was with a 91-year-old relative named Adela Navarro, who lived in a care home on the edge of Valladolid. Adela was thin, sharp-eyed, and still spoke with the kind of precision that makes you feel sloppy just sitting next to her. When Elena showed her a copy of the photograph, Adela's expression changed immediately. "That was never his wife," she said. "Not in the way people meant it." Elena leaned forward. "You knew?" Adela shook her head. "Not clearly. Not when I was young. But there were things people said. Little things. My mother used to call Inez the girl who lost her life while still alive. I didn't understand it back then." Adela remembered that Inez never married. That part was true in every branch of the family. She remembered older relatives speaking of her with respect so strong it almost sounded like guilt. She remembered hearing that she had turned down good proposals, men with work, men with land, men whose names had once mattered in local trade. People made it sound noble, Adela said, like she was above all that, but sometimes families polish a wound until it looks like a medal. That line stayed with Elena. More interviews followed. A cousin in Leon remembered hearing that Rafael, the baby in the picture, called Inez Mama Inez well into boyhood. Another relative had a family Bible with birth notes in the front and one strange sentence scribbled beside Inez's name in a different hand. She stayed so the little ones would not be split. That possibility fit the era all too well. In rural Castile in 1905, the death of a mother with several young children was more than a private sorrow. It threatened the structure of the household itself. Mothers were labor, stability, reputation, routine, survival. Without one, a family could unravel, fast. The father could remarry, if a woman were willing to take on another woman's children and a newborn. The children could be sent to aunts, grandparents, convent institutions, or neighbors. Or if an older daughter existed, she could be pushed silently into the empty place and expected to hold the whole thing together. That was the choice the Navarro family made. The photograph now looked less like a keepsake and more like an announcement. We are still intact. There is still a mother here. Nothing has fallen apart. Only, of course it had. Elena found the next layer in the municipal archives of Medina del Campo, where one stack of legal papers recorded marriage intentions and dowry negotiations. Between 1906 and 1913, Inez Navarro received at least 3 formal proposals. One came from a grain merchant's son, one from a widower with a small property and no children, one from a school clerk who later married someone else. All 3 were declined. No explanation was given because explanations were rarely required when women said no, but the pattern was clear. Opportunity had not passed her by. She had turned away from it. At first, Elena imagined that choice as simple sacrifice, almost saintly. Then she found a bundle of letters in her grandaunt's attic, tucked into a cloth band and tied with faded blue thread. Most were routine, family notes, holiday wishes, news of weather, births, repairs, harvests. But one letter written by Inez to a cousin in Madrid in 1916 broke the careful surface. "There are days," she wrote, "when I wonder who I might have been had things happened in a different order. Then Raphael laughs, or Julia asks me for help, or father leaves another account book for me because he cannot keep the house in his head the way mother did, and I tell myself that wondering is a luxury for people whose hands are free." Elena read that sentence 3 times. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't. That was what made it worse. The resignation in it was so matter-of-fact, so baked into daily life, that it felt more painful than any big confession. Another letter, written several years later, carried the same quiet ache. A house can get used to a person's service so completely that it forgets she had another shape before. There it was. Not public heroism, not family legend. A real person, privately aware that her life had narrowed around other people's needs until even she had trouble seeing its earlier outline. By then, Elena understood the basic truth. But she still wanted to know whether the family itself had acknowledged what had happened at the time, or whether the photograph had simply frozen the lie and let later generations live inside it. That answer came from a funeral card dated 1962, the year Inez died. On the reverse, beneath the prayer, someone had added a short handwritten note before mailing it to relatives. Inez Navarro, who served as mother in all but name. Elena stared at it for a long time, so they had known. Maybe not everyone, maybe not with perfect clarity, but somebody knew. Somebody understood that the woman remembered as the unmarried aunt had, for practical purposes, raised a household that should never have been hers to carry alone. Once the story spread through the living branches of the family, the reactions were messy, immediate, and deeply human. Some people felt relief. They had always sensed that the dates didn't line up, that something in the old stories had been sanded down until it no longer matched the records. For them, the new version brought order. Others felt cheated. The family tale they had inherited, the sturdy image of a grandmotherly figure who simply never married, suddenly looked less like independence and more like obligation, less like choice and more like a door closing. The strongest reactions came from the younger women. Elena's cousin Marta, who worked as a nurse in Burgos, said what several others were thinking. "I admire her," she said. "How could I not? But I also hate that everyone around her seems to have accepted that this was normal. A 17-year-old girl loses her mother, takes the baby, keeps the house standing, and somehow history calls that virtue before it calls it tragedy." The men reacted differently, but not always more comfortably. Several spoke of a strange, backward guilt the feeling of benefiting from a family line that might have broken apart if one teenage girl had not stepped into a role nobody should have demanded from her. The portrait itself changed inside all of them. Before, it had been an old family image. Useful, familiar, almost decorative. After, it became a document of pressure. A father sitting rigid with fresh grief. Two girls, old enough to know something was wrong. A baby too young to know anything. And a 17-year-old standing where her dead mother should have been, trying to project calm for the camera and the town and the years to come. Elena brought the photograph back to Dr. Varela one last time after the records, interviews, and letters had all been assembled. He agreed to help create a full restoration, not to erase its age, but to preserve it properly. During the process, details emerged that hit even harder, now that the truth was known. Inez's hand around the baby was firm, almost protective. Julia's body leaned the slightest bit toward her older sister, not toward Mateo. And Mateo himself, for all his sternness, looked tired in a way Elena had never noticed before, not cold, exhausted. This wasn't a villain's portrait. That would have been easier to sort, easier to hate. It was a portrait of a family trapped inside the rules of its time, making the decision that seemed least catastrophic and asking the most capable girl to absorb the cost. That cost rippled forward. Raphael grew up to become the sibling most devoted to family cohesion. During the hardest years of the 1930s and 1940s, he was the one who kept siblings and cousins tied together across shortages, war anxieties, and relocation. Family letters suggested he carried an almost sacred view of home, as if losing it once, even too young to remember, had marked him forever. Julia married and left town, but returned often. Clara stayed near Inez for decades. It was as though all of them, in different ways, kept orbiting the woman who had been forced to become the center. And Inez herself? She remained exactly where the photograph first showed her. In the house, in the role, in the quiet space between duty and erasure. She taught Raphael his letters. She dressed the girls for feast days. She kept account books. She nursed relatives through sickness. She turned down marriages. She buried her father. She aged into the shape the family had once needed her to imitate. By the end of her life, people no longer had to pretend she was the mother. She simply was. Not biologically, not in any official line, but in all the daily ways that count. That was the cruel brilliance of such sacrifices. They begin as substitutions and end as identities. A year after Elena first found the portrait, the family gathered in the old house near Salamanca. Copies of the restored image sat on a long table. Beside them were photocopies of the parish records, excerpts from letters, and a typed family, chronology with the corrected names and dates. Children ran in the courtyard. Older relatives spoke in clumps. Some cried. Some argued. Some laughed the way families do when the emotion gets too thick and they need a release valve. At one point, Elena watched her cousin's daughter, 20 years old and impatient with everything, stand in front of the enlarged photograph for several minutes without speaking. Finally, she said, "She looks terrified." Nobody answered right away because she was right, and because once she said it, everyone could see it, not dramatic terror, not some theatrical expression, the smaller kind, the kind a person wears when she has already accepted that there is no one else to step forward. That afternoon, the family decided two things. First, the portrait would no longer be displayed with the false identification. The plaque beneath it would read, Mateo Navarro Ruiz with his children, photographed in May 1905, 2 months after the death of Lucia, Serrano Gil. Standing with the infant is Inez Navarro, eldest daughter, who assumed the care of the household after her mother's death. Second, every year in May, the family would mark the date not as a celebration of sacrifice, but as a remembrance of truth. Not, look how noble this was. More like, look what was asked. Look what was given. Look what must not be made invisible again. That distinction mattered to Elena, because the easy version of the story was that Inez saved the family. And yes, she did. But the fuller version was harder and more honest. A girl lost her mother. A family panicked. Society offered narrow choices. A photograph was used to smooth over the rupture. and one life bent so the others could remain unbroken. By the time evening came, the restored portrait had been placed in the front room, not hidden, not romanticized, not mislabeled, just shown for what it was. Elena stood in front of it after everyone else had drifted toward dinner. Now that she knew the truth, the image no longer felt silent. It felt crowded with things nobody had said aloud in 1905. Grief, pressure, performance, love, duty, fear. A child trying to look like a mother because the world around her found that arrangement easier to bear than a widowed father and 4 motherless children. People talk about old photographs as if they preserve moments. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they preserve negotiations. Sometimes they capture not what a family was, but what it needed others to believe. That was the real power of this picture. For more than a century, it had hidden the wound by displaying the repair. Only now, after the names were corrected and the dates placed in order and the descendants allowed themselves to look honestly, could the family see what had really been there all along. Not a mother with her children, a daughter at the exact moment she stopped being only a daughter. And that may have been the saddest part of all. The camera did not capture the years of work that came after. It did not show the proposals refused, the nights awake with a sick child, the ache of a life narrowed by obligation, the private letters asking who she might have been. It caught only the beginning.